All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to WWULive, SEO and Information Architecture, How to Improve Your Site's User Experience and Reach. I'm Meredith Esquivel, Digital Marketing Whaler at Whole Whale and Dean of Whole Whale University. Whole Whale is a digital agency that leverages data and technology to increase the impact of nonprofits, and Whole Whale is our digital education arm. And on the next slide, you'll see some of our awesome clients that we've been able to work with. I'm joined today by account strategist, whaler Olivia Marlowe-Giovetti, and founder and CEO of Logic Department, Sam Raddatz. Before I hand the mic over to our speakers, I just want to note, and I've also noted this in the chat, that we will be recording the webinar and sharing the recording, the deck, and additional resources over email within the next week, so keep an eye on your inbox. We'll also have time for a Q&A, so please share your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and I'll queue them up for that Q&A at the end. So with that, I'll let Olivia and Sam tell you a little bit more about themselves.
Hi there, so I'm Sam Raddatz. I'm the founder and CEO of Logic Department. I can tell you a little bit about Logic Department. We work with nonprofits who are overwhelmed by how many web pages or websites they have and help them to consolidate their content. So another way of putting this is that we take situations such as this that are a little more cluttered, overwhelming. You might have a lot of pages going on, a lot of content going on in those pages, and try to reduce that frustration into something that looks a little bit more like this, more simplified, straightforward, easy to manage, and easy to navigate as a user. We've also worked with some organizations like this. We're working with the Trust for Public Land, which is a sample that we'll give a little bit of insight to in this presentation. And we're actually currently working with Whole Whale on a project with the JED Foundation, and we're really enjoying our work with them. So just jumping into what information architecture is, I'll give kind of a high-level overview and then hand it off to Olivia to speak in more specifics about how information architecture is approached at Whole Whale. So first off, just some quick definitions. This one comes from Abby Covert, also known as Abby the IA. I highly recommend her book, How to Make Sense of Any Mess. And her definition is information architecture is structures that we use to make sure that the information people need is easy to find and to understand. So this is very broad. This is not web specific, but this is just what information architecture is. It can look like the labels on the aisles at a grocery store, all the way to what you're seeing on a website. And then more specific to the web, we have a definition here. This is the creation of a structure for a website, application, or other project that allows us to understand where we are as users and where the information we want is in relation to our position. So this is very specific to kind of wayfinding. Another way to think about it in the real world is how you make your way around an airport. If you are standing in one spot, you want to be able to know how to get to your gate or a bathroom. That's really giving you information about where you are in relation to other things. And that's also true online. We want to know kind of where are we in this whole ecosystem that we're exploring, and where's the other thing that we might want to be looking for. So there's four main pieces to information architecture. These are organization, labeling, navigation, and search. Pretty simple concepts at the start, but once we dig into them, you can see some of the complexity that can come about when you start to tackle these things online. So just jumping into organization, I have a quick example. So say that you are a botanic research nonprofit, for example, and you have educational resources about different plants on your website that you want people to find. You might organize them in this way. You have plants overall, you have flowers and trees within that. Within your flowers, you have annuals and perennials, and within trees, you have conifers and deciduous. But as you start to consider a little bit more about the resources that you're offering, you realize that you also have succulents. So you're going to need to create a new section for that, figure out how to organize that within plants. And then you also realize that trees are technically perennial plants and they're flowering trees. So you need to work that into your system as well. And then here you can see that this results in flowers and succulents being in two places, and you needing to work through exactly how those are organized. And then also, oh, sorry, go back one. And then just really realizing that there's a lot of decisions that have to be made about how all of these things relate together. Creating one place for trees and flowers to exist, for example, that you can get to through perennials or annuals should you not know which you're looking for. And of course, this is not the only way you could organize this. There's a lot of consideration and thoughts that need to go into how you organize and put these things together. So moving on to labeling. Labeling can come up in a lot of different ways online. This is an example here from a site called Parkology, which the Trust for Public Land has created to try to encourage people that are enthusiastic about their local parks to get involved. And you can see the labeling and the navigation. That's a really common place for it. We have community, pathways, park stories, events, etc. But there's also labeling all over this page. There's a site itself called Parkology. That is a piece of labeling. There's also the champion your local park text further down. So just ways that we have to think of what are we calling these things, how will people understand them? And the interesting thing about this site specifically that we ran into is that term pathways in the navigation, while very clear to the internal team, that label meant very little to people outside of the team. The users that we spoke to weren't sure what they would find within that section of the website. So that label wasn't being super effective for them from an external point of view. And then there's the navigation. And I want to be clear that navigation for information architecture is not just the navigation of a website. This is any way that you're really exploring or getting around something. So it's how you navigate, pretty simple. But that's not only the navigation here, but also all of these links on the left, how these items are organized, again, put together in order to help you navigate this content. So as you can see, if we jumped into that navigation, maybe we clicked on that first item, we would come into a page that has even more navigation in it. So there's the in-text links on the left within the paragraphs. There are some links out to other areas. Those are navigation. We've got next steps on the right, related topics. So these are all ways that we're encouraging people to navigate to other sites of this website. And then if we were to click through those next steps, we're navigating deeper into the site. So this is a map of this site's specific navigation around these questions that they have created for parks enthusiasts. So for example, if you had landed on how can I engage my community or elected official to do more for public parks and the environment, you then might click into something like how do I connect to local advocacy groups? And that could take you deeper and deeper, navigate you further into this content. But as you can see, when we map it out like this, we can also find places where people might get lost, confused, or run into dead ends. So if you were to go down that track, you might dead end at how can I increase usage of my park, which could be a little bit frustrating for the user and could also not be benefiting your organization if you're wanting them to explore some of the other great content that you're putting out there. And in the middle, we can see a little cyclone that people can get stuck in, where they actually get stuck in a loop of content. And are seeing the same thing repeated, but might not be aware that that's what's happening. So a couple ways that navigation can run into some hiccups if it's done without careful consideration. And last but not least, there's search. So this part of the system, as we can see on the next slide, is really important in terms of how we navigate, in terms of how cutting through the organization of content if we aren't necessarily the type of person that browses through a navigation. We can cut through all of that with a search term. And so here, for example, that page we were on is really focusing on advocacy groups, and maybe we're looking for finding that page again when we come back another day, or we're looking for other advocacy information. And if you type that search term into the search, you get the page we were on. That's great. That's the success. That's what we're looking for. But on the next slide, we can see that if you search in a different way, and maybe if you search for friends of groups, which is another way some people call advocacy groups, if you want to be a friend of your local park, you might search for that instead. You're actually not going to come up with the page that we were on previously, even though that page does contain content about friends of groups and how those can be advocacy groups. So there's some ways that search can really fail you in terms of getting to that content that people are looking for, that content you're wanting them to see, if it's not carefully crafted and considered the real terms that people might be using to get to that. So at a high level, how are users really experiencing bad information architecture? When you're going through a website, how might you notice, this information architecture isn't so great? The first step is potentially getting lost in dead end or stuck in page loops. So we saw that in that navigation map before, really seeing that you could kind of end up in a place that you're not expecting, not sure how to get out where you are, or not sure what the next step is you should take. Next, we have looking in the menu and not understanding what items mean. So this could be that you have come to a site, you know the content here is what you're wanting to look at, but you're not really discerning what they're trying to drive you to in terms of the items in the navigation, the menu items that you're seeing. And when you're searching, you might come up with no results, or what's sometimes worse, irrelevant results. It can be really hard to cull through results and tell, is this the thing that's right for me, if it's not being served up to you pretty immediately in the site search. We also have some examples of people getting to a page only to encounter things that don't match their expectations of what could be within. So for example, before we talked about that pathways page, and while people were kind of interested in, whoa, what could I find behind pathways? Maybe it's about paths in my local parks, and they were getting to more information that's about toolkits and how-tos that wasn't meshing with their expectations of what they would see there. So that can really be drawing for users and kind of put them off in terms of what they're going to be seeing on other pages and their confidence across the site. So all of this leads to an overall bad user experience. It's the kind of thing that is hard to see when it's going well and very easy to see when it's going badly. Again, when you're in an airport and you need to get to your next gate, it's very obvious when you can't find it. That's kind of a bad wayfinding experience, similar to how you might feel on a website when you're like, I know this information is here, I really want to get there, and I'm just not finding it. So then we can move on to how your organization can experience bad information architecture. So internally, you might be overwhelmed because this content has just really gotten unwieldy to manage. It's very frustrating for you guys to figure out where new content should go, where existing content should be collapsed, etc. And you might not be clear about whether or not the great content that you are creating is getting used by or meeting the needs of your audience. There's a lot of different people that might be looking at your site. You might have target audiences that you're trying to reach, and you're just not clear if you're hitting the mark or not, and if you're just kind of putting content out into the void, which can be frustrating. And lastly, you could be confused about where to send people online when you're asked specific questions by your audience members or your funders or your board or even other colleagues. When someone comes to you and says, oh, I really want to get more information on X, or I really want to find a resource on Y, and you're saying, I think you might be able to find it on this site or on this page, but I'm not really sure, I'll have to get back to you. So that's a good trigger to notice. If you're not sure where people should go, that might be a sign of bad information architecture. Of course, we want to fix this. We don't want to just sit in this bad information architecture. So what are some things that we can do to fix information architecture? The first thing is that we can determine what to keep, toss, or consolidate, which Olivia will be talking to a little bit more. We can also look for gaps of information that we might not be covering right now, things that your audience is looking for in terms of information that they want that you don't have, or things that you internally want to be putting out there in the world that has not been created yet or not consolidated and put out there in the right way. Then we can reorganize and relabel the content that we are keeping or adding. So making sure that the organization and labeling matches both your internal goals, but also the needs of your users, so that that great content is getting to them in the way that they understand best. And you can also create a solid thesaurus for your internal search. So different search systems work in different ways. So I'm saying this pretty broadly, but generally trying to make a connection between the ways people are looking for your information on your site and the way that you organize that information internally, and making sure that that language is really speaking to each other and allowing them to be successful in their navigation and searching. So some tools that we can use to accomplish these things. The first thing we always recommend is doing an inventory and map of the content that you have. So this really gives you a good sense of what is here, what is kind of the mess we're dealing with, and how can we start to tackle that, and what are the steps we need to take. A lot of people think that they only have a couple pages or like maybe 30 pages on their site, and they'll find, oh, actually we have about 200 pieces of content when you count our blog posts, any resources we're putting in the world, etc. So it can be very eye-opening to see what's there. We also really recommend getting input directly from your audience. It can be easy to kind of have a gap between us and the people that are looking at our content, or not be sure how to get input from them. But it's very important to just get those insights into how are they referring to these things, because as the people that are putting it out there, we're very close to it. We have a curse of knowledge, so to speak, and we know kind of too much almost to make sure that we're making it clear to other people what we have for them and in the ways that they'd be looking for it. And then last but not least, looking at SEO and analytics can be really eye-opening in terms of determining what should stay or go, how to collapse it together, and get some information also in terms of how people are searching for this information, namely from an organic search point of view. So I'll pass it off to Olivia to tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Anne. So looking at the theory of information architecture, let's put that into practice. And we're going to use as an example for this, Whole Whale's own website. I have been working with the Whole Whale website since last summer. When I joined Whole Whale in 2017, we had about 100 resources on the tips section of our website. And as of last summer, we had over 300. So we realized that we were at a point where our own navigation was getting hard to follow. The resource categories that we had set up our resources had outgrown the categories that we had set up for them. And we also had a lot of redundant content. So we wanted to make sure that we were creating as intentional a user journey as possible from the pages that people were first encountering with our site, the front doors of our website, to the pages where we want them to take key action. So to follow Sam's process, we first reviewed the existing content, decided what to keep, toss, and consolidate. We're now working through optimizing the pages that we want to keep. And we are, as we execute these action items, we're also monitoring results, because if we are doing all of this work, we want to make sure that it's working for us. So looking first at reviewing existing content, there are a couple of ways that we can do this. And I highly recommend working through Google Analytics for it, using either content drill down if most of your content lives in one section, or all pages if you have content across multiple site sections. And we will take a look at Google Analytics in just a moment. As we go through this, however, we want to look at two key factors, the page views and the bounce rate. And we want to export all of this to a spreadsheet, which is super simple with Google Analytics. Before I jump into that, for anyone who's on this webinar who is not familiar with Google Analytics, it is first and foremost free. And it's a web analytics tool that you can add to your website through some very simple JavaScript. It lives on every page. Every website code base can handle this. It takes less than 30 minutes to install. And it's a great way of understanding the what, where, how, and when of activities that happen on your site. You are basically on your own in terms of extrapolating why, but when we don't have our own users to talk to, such as Logic Department mentioned with sort of one-on-one or focus group interviews, this can be a great way of understanding from the data how people are engaging with our content. So I'm going to actually pivot into Google Analytics for Whole Whale. As I mentioned, we can use two different ways of pulling content from our site. For Whole Whale, the majority of our site content all lives under a section called tips. And so for us, we can use content drill down. We can also, under behavior and site content, look at all pages if you have one of those websites where you have a bunch of different sections that all have content. When I'm going into the content drill down, I'm under tips. And when we're pulling information, it's good to get at least a year, if not more, worth of data on your site content. A couple of caveats with using Google Analytics in this way. You want to get at least a year because some of your content is inevitably going to be seasonal. For instance, at Whole Whale, we have a piece on our site of ideas for Giving Tuesday. And in that sense, we want to make sure that we're getting at least a year because people are more likely to look up Giving Tuesday ideas in September than they are in January. From there, after we set an appropriate time frame, and here, for instance, I've gone from August 1st of 2018 to August 21st, 2019, and we're in the tips section. We can export all of this. This works with a few different ways of aggregating data. If you have Google Sheets, you can connect it directly to your analytics account. If you use Excel, you can export it that way. And if you use another type of data management platform, you can export it as a CSV. What that leads us to is building out a spreadsheet that is rooted in the Google Analytics, We can see, for instance, each of the addresses on site, the page views that each one received in, I believe for this spreadsheet that I put together, it equals about 2 years worth of engagement, and the bounce rate. And what I did with this spreadsheet is set up some conditional formatting where we can set a midpoint within each of the columns to say, this is the average that we see for page views on site. Anything above this is above average, anything below this is below average. Also a good idea to factor out some of your outliers. For instance, Giving Tuesday Ideas is incredibly high performing compared to some of our average pieces. Similarly, a lot of your pages are going to have a bounce rate of 100% or 0% depending on how many or how few page views it gets in a period of time. Again, a couple of caveats with this, or a couple of definitions with this. Google Analytics will only give you, when you go through exporting content in this way, the pages that have been visited in that time frame. So if you have, for instance, more resources than are coming up in a time frame and they aren't displaying in the spreadsheet, that's because no one has visited it in that time frame that you've set up. And if that means that you have a piece of content that hasn't been viewed in 2 years, probably a good idea just to sunset that content, or if there is something vital to it, optimizing it for SEO. Similarly with bounce rate, as a quick definition for this is the percentage of people who have on that page interacted, landed on that page, and left without taking any further meaningful action. There are a few ways that you can define meaningful action, and we have some resources on wholewhale.com about bounce rate and setting up a few different events to get a better sense of user engagement. But these are both important because you want to make sure that people are visiting that page and that they're engaging with it. From there, we've added some other columns, as you can see, looking at what we're keeping versus what we're tossing. We have a status update on each of these because, as I mentioned, I've been working on this for over a year, so we want to make sure that as we go through this, that we're keeping track of what's been updated, because it's likely if you have a lot of content, this could take some time. And then, as Sam mentioned, we want to also make sure that we have everything, a place for everything and everything in its place. And so as we go through our content structure, we also want to make sure that we're updating the categorizations that we have on our site, and that everything fits under one key category. One of the things that we're doing at Whole Whale as we go through our content, in order to come up with categories that make the most sense, is tailoring our categories similarly to how we tailor our services. So we do work with SEO and content marketing. We do work with paid advertising, with the Google Ad Grant, with digital fundraising, and each of those gets its own category. Now, just because everything, because we want to make sure that everything has engagement and traffic, doesn't mean that everything that's a low performing page is going to get tossed. And in fact, I'll go back one slide to show that, for instance, we have this one page that has performed above average in the last couple of years around Facebook advertising grants for nonprofits. I hear a few of you right now saying, what's a Facebook advertising grant for nonprofits? It was a one-time experiment that Facebook ran that is no longer being used, and so it's no longer relevant. We have a similar piece of content on site around Google Ad Grant Pro, which was a higher tiered version of the Google Ad Grant that is also a former initiative run by the Google Ad Grants team, no longer available. We have kept that and sunset the Facebook advertising grants for one key reason. And we can see here that the bounce rate for this is significantly higher than some of our other pages, which tells me that we have people coming to this page, but they are not getting what they want out of it. And that user experience is so important because not only is it, not only do we obviously want people to engage with the content on our site and take another action, but it's something that's important for Google because it monitors your site not only based on a few of the key issues that Google looks for on the technical side, It also will track users when they go from a Google search engine results page to your site and see how many of them bounce off of your site without taking another action. So we want to make sure that we are presenting to Google the best face for our website and getting people to where they want to go. And we want to make sure that what they're searching for and what we present in search results aligns with their expectations. That means in some of these pages that have gotten fewer page views in the last year or 2 years, it may not be that they are pages that should be wholesale removed. For instance, we can see here, we have a guide to Yoast on our site. One of the reasons we're keeping that is that it's something that our clients ask for a lot. And so we know that even though we don't have a lot of interaction on it at the moment, if we were to do some edits on our guide to Yoast for SEO, and we'll talk about how to optimize pages in just a moment, that might improve our search engine rankings. We also know with some of these resources that it's just important for us to have them on site for some key users. So one of the ways that you can look at this, we either know from, say, our clients that we send probably 1 and 2 clients our guide to Yoast so that they know how to use it. We also may see that with some pages, the bounce rate is significantly lower. And even though the traffic is low, the engagement is high, which means that we may just have a very niche piece that benefits the right group of users for whole whale. So as we go through this, we make decisions based on what to keep and what to toss. We'll also look at what pages that we want to optimize. And one of the ways that we look at optimization is also against consolidation, because as you can see from some of these pages, there are a number of pages that are essentially touching on the same topics. The old rule of SEO was that every page, every keyword that we wanted to index for warranted its own page, which means that if we were looking for to index around nonprofit data culture and data culture for nonprofits, we may need to have 2 separate pages because Google was looking at that direct correlation. Google, and when I say Google, I mean basically every search engine, because every search engine is mimicking Google, has become much more semantically intelligent, even in the last year, the last 18 months. So what we look at now with consolidation is, do we have the same keyword target? And do we have the same user goal or intention in mind with pages? This is a great resource from Moz, and we'll talk about Moz a little bit more in just a moment. But this can be a good flowchart for understanding how we want to consolidate and if we want to consolidate content. This can happen for a number of reasons. You may have been following the old rules of SEO. At Whole Whale, we have a lot of fantastic interns that come in, write content for our site, and then go back to school or go on to the next adventure in their life. And it's hard when you're managing a lot of things in addition to your site content to make sure that you're not buying accidentally a 3rd white button-down shirt. This is the time where you can step back and say, okay, are we estimating that 80% or more of our searchers for each of these 2 keywords have the same goal and intent? Is someone looking for nonprofit data culture looking for essentially the same thing as data culture for nonprofits, or even how to build a data culture? Probably. Can the keywords be logically merged into the title or headline of the page? If they can, fantastic. You're going to want to look at a single page to target these keywords. If it's a little less logical that they live together, you may want to work with separate pages, knowing that it might lead to a less than ideal experience. This is fine. SEO is not baking. It's not a precise scientific, if you are 1 centimeter over the measuring cup, everything is gone to heck and you're not winning the Great British Bake Off. SEO is more of cooking, where you have a recipe, you have a set of ingredients, but if you need to make substitutions, if you need to underpour your olive oil, if you need to go a little more aggressive on the paprika because you're out of garlic salt, that's fine. What we want to look for is building over time a more engaging user experience. We also look at consolidating content when we have historic updates. So for instance, when there are changes made to the Google Ad Grant, as we are seeing a lot more of these days, we can take older pages that announced updates to Ad Grant policy from 2013 and move them into one page, since there should be one single source of truth on that. We can also look at content that underperforms but is relevant to a higher performing page or pillar content. So for instance, we'll take a look at a few pieces that we had around nonprofit data culture. Many of them were underperforming, but they were all relevant to one of the things that Whole Whale focuses on the most, which is building a data culture within nonprofits, B Corps, and social impact organizations. So rather than just saying, none of this works, we're going to delete it all, we can move it into one page that is optimized against current SEO practices. As I just mentioned, nonprofit data culture. We had a piece on the site called How to Build a Data Culture into Your Company Culture. We had a piece asking if your organization has a data fiefdom, which is our way of describing the antithesis of a data culture. We had a page, does your nonprofit have a data culture? And we had a page on building a data culture with an infographic. Obviously, all of these pages essentially target the same keywords and the same user intent. All of these pages are written for someone working at a nonprofit or a social impact, looking to build data culture, and helping them make those next steps to establish that data culture and also to define it. When we looked at this in Google Analytics, these were how some of the numbers shook out for about 2 years worth of engagement. The highest performing page was our data culture page, with 546 page views and a pretty average bounce rate. All of these had pretty average bounce rates, but we can see that we're sort of diluting our own value for our content on data culture, with all of these pages saying essentially the same thing. So looking at this, we also want to address that curse of knowledge that Sam touched on in terms of the best way of presenting this online. We can look at a number of different ways of explaining a data culture or a data fiefdom. And for instance, data fiefdom is something that we know internally at Whole Whale, but not everybody else knows it. Other people are going to look for data culture versus fiefdom. So this brings us to how we want to optimize for SEO, because SEO is an important aspect of our information architecture. Optimizing our content for SEO means that we're meeting users on their level versus having them come and meet us on our level, which means that ultimately we're going to be broadening our reach and finding more users who care about the message that we have, the work we do, the values that we stand for. Information architecture also hugely benefits your SEO from a search engine experience. We want to help search engines understand our site's content. Google and every other website organizes and determines results by crawling the internet through both links and page content. They analyze the content on each page, they store it in their search indexes, and then when a user is searching for something, passing through ranking algorithms, the websites that are stored in the search engines index are sorted against different queries and keywords and fed up to the user as results. So when we can make Google's job or any search engine's job easier by understanding not only what each of our pages on our site are about, but also how they're connected in this larger understanding of our site. So for instance, if we're going back to the airport analogy, and if we are JFK, we have a number of different terminals, but if you're looking at a map of the airport, you understand from, say, if you're getting on the air train, exactly how each of those terminals fit in, and then which airlines belong to which terminal. We also want to create that user experience where once a user lands on our site, because we've optimized for the crawlers of the internet, that they're getting from that front door, that first page that they see on our website, which is very rarely the homepage, to taking a key action. For a nonprofit, for a social impact organization, this could be signing up for email updates. This could be making a donation. This could be signing a petition. This could be registering for an event. We want to get them there quickly, and we want to create, as I mentioned before, those intentional user journeys. These are all aspects of SEO that are very symbiotic with information architecture. And the reason that information architecture matters so much is that we want to get people to take these actions. We want to define why we have a website, how it matches with our mission, and then tailor the user experience to furthering that mission. So I've mentioned Moz a few times. Again, possibly a new tool for some people on this webinar. Moz is an SEO tool for nonprofits. It is not free, but they do offer a nonprofit discount of 75% off, which means that you could be paying something like $25 a month for it. We get no kickbacks at Whole Whale for recommending it, but it does have an incredible user experience for people who may come from a strong content background and not necessarily a strong technical background. And it becomes an all-in-one tool for your website's SEO. You can run technical crawls to make sure that there aren't broken links on site, which could lead users to dead ends. You can monitor rankings for certain keywords and search queries and also find new opportunities. You can get feedback for optimizing your landing pages against those keywords, which we'll look at in a moment. You can also use it both for tracking competition and building backlinks to your content. So as you're writing content, you're going to want to make sure, because Google is crawling the site by links from one site to the other, that you're getting links from other websites. And finally, with Moz, it's also just a great learning resource for staying on top of SEO. This is a frequently changing field, so no book is really going to do SEO justice. But a website like Moz that can update its content, that can share new updates once a week, fantastic resources for learning. So going back to the example of our nonprofit data culture, we said that we were looking at this keyword target of nonprofit data culture. And we were going to take the data culture page on Whole Whale's website and fold this other existing content into it. But we want to make sure that we are putting our best foot forward when it comes to meeting users on their level. So within Moz, under Moz Pro and page optimization, you can see I've already laid it up here. We can add the page that we currently have, and we can add the keyword that we're trying to index against. The benefit of this being that when we then have it track, which you can do at the pro level, it'll give you immediate feedback as to what is helping your ability to rank #1 in Google search results and what's hurting your ability. So when we had some of this content written, it wasn't necessarily written with search engines in mind, which means we can go back and retrofit what we've written from a purely editorial perspective and make sure that we are presenting it in a way that Google knows, oh, this page is about nonprofit data culture. We can look at a few of the areas that are hurting our score and start to address them. And each of these comes with its own explanation from Moz, along with other resources you can take a look at. Usually what we want to make sure we're doing is getting the keyword in some key, no pun intended, areas like the page title, the URL, the meta description, and in some of the header tags. Moz will also make recommendations for content suggestions, which are other pieces of text that appear most frequently in what is currently the top 10 results in Google search results, which means any page on the front page of Google, they will look at the keywords that are being used on those pages and look for similarities. So for instance, nonprofit data, we see a few pages that use this, which means it's a keyword that we should most likely include in our own content so Google can pair like with like. This is one of the ways that Google is becoming much more semantically intelligent. So as we're writing content, we can keep some of these notes in mind so that we're optimizing pages to have a better appearance in search traffic. What that can lead us to is, as we can see here, landing in the #1 spot for a search on nonprofit data culture with a page that combines all of our previous data culture resources titled how to build a data culture, and why it matters for social impact. Now, we're looking at a slightly different title than nonprofit data culture. And again, this is because we now have this freedom within Google to be a little bit more loose with how we approach the keyword, because Google can put 2 and 2 together. We included the Moz recommendations, we streamlined into one piece of content. And the final aspect of this is that we're updating the internal links on site. So one way you can do this is to, in Google, start with a search that includes site, your site, and then the keyword, which means we can find every page that on our site that mentions nonprofit data culture, or even just data culture, and make sure that we're linking to this specific page from any other page on site. Again, this creates not just a good experience and site map for search engines, but also for users. And then we want to monitor success. So within Google Analytics, this takes a little bit of creative searching, because chances are if you're making edits to multiple pages of content or even just one piece of content, you might be updating the URL. So you'll need to get a little creative with comparing this over time, since obviously you'll have one URL that's brand new and one URL that's no longer being used. But what we can tell from our nonprofit data culture piece is that when we edited it on May 20th, 2019, since then and August 19th, we had 575 page views. Looking at this year over year, for all of the total pages that we saw all the way back here, the total combined page views for the period between 5/20 and 8/20, 2018 was 429. This may seem like a very small increase in traffic, but when we think about it, it's a few months and a 34% increase in page traffic, plus a decrease in average bounce rate from 22.5%, which is very much on the high end for whole whale, to 6.6%, which is above average or below average, since we want our bounce rate to be low. In general, we look for a benchmark of 20% increase in organic traffic year over year, so that we're already at 34% higher engagement means that we're creating a more streamlined opportunity for users to get to this page. And we're also creating a better search engine experience and search engine content structure, so that search engines can more easily find our site and have it be the #1 result when you search for nonprofit data culture. And then we want to continue to optimize this. So for instance, this is how our final page shook out in terms of how to build a data culture and why it matters for nonprofits. We can continue to monitor this in Moz. I recommend checking in on key pages once every couple of months, because you want to maintain those search rankings. It's highly important for building out that organic traffic, and even the difference between being #1 and #2 in search engine results can double or cut your organic traffic to that page in half. So I have said nonprofit data culture way more times in the last 20 minutes than I have in the last week. And with that, I think it's probably a good chance for us to move to Q&A.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you to Sam as well. People have been sending in questions, so we'll start with those, but keep sending them into the chat. This first question is for Sam. What's the best way to get input about how users are navigating the site directly from your audience?
I love this question so much. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this. I think the first thing to point out is that you can do it by just speaking to a few people. I think one thing that people get really overwhelmed by when we're talking about getting input from their users or their audiences is like, oh, we're gonna have to do, you know, a statistically relevant sample. We need 300 people. And there are ways, especially when you're working in qualitative research, to get a smaller sample and still get a lot of context and information that you can make decisions based on moving forward. So the way I would recommend doing it in terms of a small sample, if you're able to kind of reach out to your audience, maybe through a Twitter account you have or an email list, and ask if there's anyone that would like to give you a hand. And then you can actually do remote sessions with people and actually observe them using your site. It's really helpful if you can consider kind of the tasks that you would like them to be completing when they come to your site, or tasks that you know are common for people to complete on your site. It could be anything from donating or all the way to just looking for a specific type of resource, and you could get some sense of how they're doing that. Another way to do it is called a tree test. So this is a way you can do it where you can send out a link to a lot of people and see who's able to respond. But a tree test is basically giving you the ability to only test how someone navigates your site, devoid of any graphic design or layout and things like that. You're really just focusing in on how people find their way around. So I recommend looking into that. I could talk about tree tests for hours, but it's another way that you can kind of more hands-off get some feedback in terms of how people are finding their way around. And you can also do that with things that you would like to change to see how effective they are. And if you get enough responses, you can do that in a more like statistically based way. And then of course, there's also looking at Google Analytics that will give you some sense of kind of how people are making a flow through the site, depending on page views and how they're making those links. So there's a few different ways you can do it, but the key being, you know, you only have to only get a few touch points of input to get a lot of really helpful feedback there.
Right, so some homework is to check out tree tests. Another question for Sam. This attendee says, we have a map technology to show our local member chapters, and it's never up to date. And they're thinking about getting rid of it. What is your advice around deciding whether or not to move forward?
So I guess if the case is that that needs to be updated internally, and that's just not something that everyone has the capacity to do, I would consider kind of how vital it is to your users. You could look at page views and see how many people are looking at it. If the bounce rate is high, that might be a sign that they're not finding the information they need. But yeah, it's a little bit of a it depends answer, because if it's really important to your mission or to getting people to events and things like that, then it's probably more prioritizing it internally to get it updated. If it's something that external people need to be updating and you're just not seeing the interaction with it, might be time to sunset that.
Great advice. This next question is for Olivia. When you're consolidating and have multiple pages targeting the same topic, is it better to keep the page with more page views or the page that targets a better keyword?
I love this question. So there are a couple of different ways you can go about doing this. And I would say the big question is there a major discrepancy between page views? So for instance, when we were looking at the page views for our nonprofit data culture pages, we saw that there were a couple that were very low performers, and then a couple that had fairly comparable page views, something in the 500 range, something in the 300 range. I would recommend generally going with the highest performing page, unless it's a very marginal, say fewer than 5% difference between the page views on a better keyword page. The benefit with going with the page that has a higher page views is that you can always, if the keywords are similar enough, retrofit it against the better playing keyword, and you'll tend to see that the traffic and the value that you get from that keyword plays well with the traffic that you're already getting. Google does look at, to some degree, how many people are visiting key pages, and if they see that one is far and away performing better, if you have 10,000 views on one page versus 1,000 views on another page, it's better to build on the bright spot of that MVP.
Awesome. Another question that I think Olivia and Sam will need to contribute to is it worth creating a sitemap and linking to it in your footer or elsewhere? Who wants to start?
I defer to Sam on this.
Well, I hate to always say it depends, but I think it's really a question of kind of how complex your site is. There are still people that look for that, I'll say. So when we have seen people still including that on their site, it does get some use. I couldn't tell you the details of who those people are and why they still do that, but there is some users that do things like that. I've seen it a lot mostly in like e-commerce as a way of like showing people the structure that's being built there. So it can be a good way to show kind of behind the curtain, but I don't feel like it's required unless, Olivia, you have a indexing requirement that really needs it.
No, from an indexing standpoint, you'll want to obviously submit a sitemap to Google, which you can do through Google Search Console, and submit that regularly whenever you make major updates to the site. But in terms of a sitemap that's user-facing, you could try using it, especially if sometimes with what I love about Google Analytics is that sometimes you'll have a couple of people come from what we call an N of one, which is I expect this when I go to a website, and so I think that we should have it on our website. Sometimes that person is your boss. Sometimes that person is a major donor. You can always test it out and then use Google Analytics to see, are people actually using this as a resource? And if they are, then yeah, keep using it. And if not, then it's, you know, you can safely sunset it and just focus on strong site navigation.
So ask your doctor, results may vary for that one. All right, next question. I think we'll start with Olivia on this. There were actually two questions that are pretty similar. So back in the day, you could see what search strings people were using to find us from Google. In 2013, I think Google changed the privacy rules, so we can't see those search strings anymore. That's a big deal because on some of my sites, upwards of 90% of traffic comes from Google. Can Moz help with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are a few ways of getting around this. I imagine that this person is using Google Search Console. You can get a lot more information from Google Search Console about the search terms that people are using to land on your site than you can from Google Analytics. Oftentimes in Google Analytics, what we'll see is keyword not provided. But if you have your site connected to Google Search Console as well, you can go onto that platform and see a bit more. I'm going to actually pivot back to Moz for a moment because there is also a way of accomplishing this a little bit through Moz, although Moz's data also comes from Google. And so again, take it with a grain of salt. But if, for instance, I were to pull up Whole Whale's piece on, well, let's just call it nonprofit data culture. Because this is a valuable question in terms of, are we optimizing for the best keyword, or is there another keyword that is taking more users to our page that we should focus on more? So once I'm here, I am going to go in Moz Pro, Keyword Explorer, and then for any given page, and the best part about this, by the way, is that you can do this for any page on the internet, so it's a great competitive research tool. But I want to explore the keywords that are bringing people onto this exact page. I search for that, and I can see, for instance, with this, that I have 6 ranking keywords, and I get a sense of where I'm currently ranking. Now, as you can see here, we were seeing that we were ranking #1 for a couple of nonprofit data culture keywords that aren't listed here, which again is a moment of check with your doctor, results may vary. But we can see what we are ranking for, the relative difficulty of ranking for that keyword, and the monthly volume, which is it's not ideal in that we don't know exactly how many people are coming onto our site from each keyword, but we can start to make guesstimates that, for instance, data culture, or I would be willing to say more data culture since it's at #2, and what is fiefdom, we are ranking #41, is bringing more people to our site. It's not ideal, but if you wanted to get a perspective outside of Google, it's a good alternative.
This next question is kind of in a similar vein. So when you're on Google Analytics, the behavior flow seems very confusing. How else can you see how people are navigating through the site via analytics? How can you get those strings, not before the search, but after?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say with going through the behavior flow, it is pretty confusing. I would, in those cases, what I tend to focus on are the people who are completing goals on our site. That's a good way of looking at it, if depending on how much site traffic you have. And you can go into, let me just pull up Google Analytics once again. So what we can see here in reverse goal path is that we can see the number of steps that people take to get to a certain goal completion on site. And we can even filter that out by goals like interested users, which we have a goal tracking for both people staying on our site for more than 5 minutes, and a goal based on how many pages per session they look at. So this is one way of understanding how people flow from one page to the next. And also focusing on the people that we want more of, the people who are taking meaningful action. In terms of understanding it from a broader perspective, especially when you want to look at drop-off, you can also look at drop-off within, unfortunately, it is another funnel visualization, but we can get a sense of where we might be losing people within the funnel visualization, and I think I need to update my date flow on this. As I pull this up, Sam, do you have any feedback from your side on this?
No, I would say, I mean, I feel like the more intimate you get with that user flow on Google Analytics, the kind of more used to it you can get. Oh, sorry, helicopter. One thing that we have done is kind of translated those into like a paper map that feels a lot easier to understand if you can just take a little bit of time with it and map it out on a piece of paper in front of you. I find that helpful just as like a motor memory kind of exercise, but also can kind of take out some of the clutter that you're seeing when you're looking at analytics and just get down to these steps that people are accomplishing. So that's one way we kind of extrapolate that out into something more easy to understand.
Cool. And this is another better funnel example with some drop off.
Yeah, so these are the people who have either signed up for Whole Whale's email list or have dropped off from it, and we can understand where we might be losing them. In terms, though, of the behemoth behavior flow that we have on site, I do think that it is certainly a thing when we look at it like this. But what you can also do is just start to drill down into each page, which might help if you want to chart progress through any number of key pages. So for instance, we have a page on our site about winning and cheating online voting contests, which ranks incredibly highly for that keyword, but is actually a bit of a rant from our founder, George. But we can see from there, and when you start to drill it down by page, if you're starting to look at the top pages, you can go through this, and it's one way of also just having this be a little bit more of a manageable monster.
We have time for, I just want to squeeze in one more question, because there were a lot of great ones out there. This one is for Sam. Any thoughts on creating a main menu navigation bar that does not have drop-down menu and instead uses a secondary navigation menu on each page? I've been told that this helps direct the user flow.
Yeah, I think that is one way that you can kind of direct users if you're wanting to put them down a specific path. One of the nice things about allowing drop down from the start is allowing people to see the spread of their options more quickly. So it's more of a serendipitous search. If someone's like, oh, I think what I want is going to be in this section, they can more easily kind of hover over and get a sense of what's within each and maybe get more context about if the path they're going to go down is correct. But if you have a relatively simple navigation, so maybe you only have 3 items and one of them is about, what you're going to find in there is they probably have pretty high confidence of what they're going to get when they click in. And in that case, something like another page that highlights all of the options within that, seems totally fine. So it's a little bit dependent on how much content you have in your navigation and your menus, and how much you're hoping to direct people versus allow them to choose their own adventure a little more easily from the start.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Sam. And thank you to both Sam and Olivia. We are just over time, so I want to be mindful of all of our attendees' time and just wrap up now. We have in the deck, and this will be sent over along with the recording, our contact information, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want more information about SEO or information architecture. And then Whole Whale has just launched all of our courses on our own website, on our own learning platform. So go to wholewhale.com/university to check it out. You can also use this code for a discount on our courses. We have a new one on the Google Ad Grant. It's recently updated with all the policy changes of the last year and a half or so. So highly recommend checking that out. Thank you again, Sam and Olivia, and thank you to all the attendees for joining. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.